I just want to introduce David King. David went to undergrad at OSU, correct? And grad school at Tyler. We've known each other for quite some time, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So I will hand it off to David. And go ahead.
All right,
Thank
great.
you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was the easiest commute to a visiting lecture had so far. Yeah, this is really great. I know, it was kind of lined up to come and see you all at around this time. Physically, that would have been fun, but I, just say that feel fortunate that we can still get together, try to look for the silver lining in all this. I'll get right into it. Please, I guess you can't interrupt me with questions, but that would be, preferred. Type them down, write them down. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to chat a little bit more about some of this stuff if possible. So I don't know, I just like to start with this slide. A little bit of influence, a fan of the art of Bruce Nauman. There's not a lot of text in my work, but I like the directness of this work and this piece in particular, and a good way to start, I think, a slide lecture. There'll be things said, speaking to text, but, I'm going to try to frame what you're looking at with words. But there's a lot in between in the spaces that I'm probably irresponsible to try to define, and also, that I just don't have time to say. So start here. This is start here for a couple reasons. The idea of a big dumpster, hopefully there's some appreciation for this as a tool of sorts, like a material retrieval, also a place to sort of get rid of, exercise your old projects or ideas that fail, or even the successes that have no place else to go, but sort of go back into the fold. But this is the back of Ohio State University's Sherman Studio Art Center. This is where, really my art making and the way I function now began back in the early 2000s, like 2004, 2003, something like that. I think I started coming out to this building. But yeah, the dumpster, maybe the other version of this is where a lot of my work ends up. It's a storage space, this idea of value, whether it's, things trying to participate in that idea of alchemy, of taking something that's not valuable and make it somehow more important, more valuable, more precious through labor, but also that, these things don't really end up being worth anything. They're kind of just vehicles for ideas. I split this presentation into sections. This was sort of a new idea, fresh for this opportunity. And I'm starting here with nature, and nature being defined really as light and then color, which is a major part of the way I work, and maybe perception in there as well. This action was pretty central to what I'm doing currently. It was an experiment that I undertook as a graduate student. This is, I think, 2009. And I was having a conversation with somebody who ended up being on my committee, graduate committee. Those of you in grad school are all familiar with that system. And he was talking about this idea of transparency. And there's this, this sort of idea of purity for those of us in the glass field, that, color and somehow works against the purity of the material. And, working exclusively with clear glass, at least at the time, and I think still so. There's certain maybe institutions or a group of artists who kind of adhere to this idea of working with clear glass exclusively. But I like to sort of subverting this idea by taking clear glass, clear window glass, making this crude, pretty straightforward prism with it, putting water in it, putting it in a lighted window, and it creating color. So This idea of transparency also is something about sort of the essential nature of the material and its ability to, what it can do functionally, in this case, produce colored light when it's manipulated in such a way. So this was really a pretty big epiphany. A lot of things grow out of this. I'll actually return to those two pictures quite frequently as like kind of seeing in the different ways it's become a source for different projects. But one of the things I considered was that I was working with this color, this kind of found color in a way through refracting white light from the sun. And so I thought of other ways to do that. One of those ways being collecting color from the trash, from product packaging, essentially, stuff I otherwise would have thrown out or put into a recycling bin. So so this was one of the ways that manifested, just sort of piling up in my studio in these cardboard boxes, just kind of separating it out, sort of like enacting the prism in a way. And something I came around, so this is actually, sort of bookends of my graduate experience. So that was, the prism making was sort of early on. This was right at the end during my thesis exhibition, taking this colored trash and through technology, but also sort of crude mechanical positioning of another kind of technology, trying to reconfigure that colored light back into white light. So I made this this contraption that went on the wall. These panels of mirror were positioned to individually reflect those boxes of collected color. There's a camera in the space. This white circle you see at the top of the screen, that's also being collected by the central mirror, actually reflected off the mirror that's in the bottom of the screen. And then it all comes back into this camera, masked by this piece of white paper. And here's another angle. And then the camera goes to a projector. And then when the camera was focused on the white paper, it would kind of blend all that color coming into the video feed into this corona of colored light. And this was like live action video. It was going in the space. So it was a fun thing to see people sort of interact with it, try to figure out what was happening, kind of put their hand in front of the camera and get this sense of like, oh, that's where that's coming from. So it's this sort of puzzle they're figuring out, and that's something I really enjoyed about it. So really this inversion, thinking of it as, starting with nature and the colored light, this is an inversion of that process using artifice, printed materials, colored plastic, and technology. Okay, so back to these couple images, making the refracted beam. Another thing I ended up doing was recording that being projected onto the wall and then materializing it in, this is actually cut up plastic, like bread tabs, caps to soda bottles, just the sort of plastic that ends up piling up in our oceans mostly, making this mosaic, and you can see it's sort of a similar idea of materializing this natural light in this really artificial way. Which is another, I think, somewhat similar project. These were large blown glass spheres that I cut in half, cut a circle of window glass to seal water inside of them, and then they're backed with this collage of collected cardboard color. And these are interesting in that, they would kind of wobble and shift and reflect and distort and flip the scene behind them. And so they had this really sort of transient feel to them as you moved around. But this was, another version of a color wheel in a similar way. Photographed outside in nature. Here is, a smaller one of these objects. There's a time here where I was making these, I was just really playing with them, thinking about observation, thinking about glass's function in science, for different apparatus of observation. This was a full moon. This was at the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, and on a night of a full moon. So this sort of crude telescope where one person holds it up, another person tries to see the moon a little closer or distort it or something. And I had this idea, I think this is also a sort of a bookend in another direction of that idea of refracting the sunlight, was taking it out and taking a prism out here and seeing if I could refract the moonlight, which was pretty impossible to document, but here kind of an image of this prism. And we get there's a little section of refracted light in there. Okay, so the next section, portraits. So getting a little bit more into like history, the history I'm interested in, my own history and influences, and kind of my take on representation. And this kind of drawing is something that goes, way back before I learned to blow glass or got to art school, or this was how my creative energy was manifested. One of the things I talked to Nadine about was talking a little bit about how I function as an artist in terms of working at home, and and I think the ways in which I do that now are really based on this practice of this meticulous kind of drawing. And these drawings were really always of people that I admired. When I was a kid, it was like sports heroes, and then it became musicians that I really loved and admired. And it's become kind of artists and scientists and a diverse range of figures. But this is Woody Guthrie, the last one. This is Kim Deal. Kim Deal actually from the same city I grew up in, Dayton, Ohio. And her father worked at the same place my dad worked. So kind of, thinking about connection to some of these people too. This is Isaac Newton. I have no personal connection to Isaac Newton, but a portrait I did of him for a show that I had in Columbus, Ohio. The gallery there was called Roy G. Biv, that acronym for the 7 color index that Newton developed. And the interesting thing for me with cursory research was that this 7 color system was developed. I made this series of bowls. This was, I think, part of this portrait of Newton. I made this series of bowls in the 7 colors, but that was based on his idea of color, his color chart, which associated the colors with other examples of 7 in nature, that being, at the time, there were 7 identifiable planets in the solar system, and there's 7 notes on the major scale in music. So he had this theory of harmony in nature, and that's a big reason why he chose 7 as the number to associate with the color system. But what I like about this was it's kind of awkward because he was also noticing that certain colors had special properties or special relationships to the colors across from the others when you start to chart them. So this idea of complementary colors. So some of this is my speculation, but that he made this this kind of strange unequal color chart where orange and indigo get less real estate to kind of accommodate for that idea of putting them across from their complements. So in honor of that, with my series of bowls, this was a retail gallery of sorts. I had these bowls priced in an explanation explaining why the bowls were a certain price, except for orange and indigo were half price based on Newton's color wheel. So that's how convoluted I can get, which you'll see it'll get worse. This is Michel Eugene Chevreul, who is a French chemist, and he came up with this idea of simultaneous contrast. He was working in in a rug factory and noticed that the threads in the rug would create this like halo of a third color when they're really close to each other, and developed this theory of simultaneous contrast that artists have used, obviously designers and artists have used, and the pointillists used it to great effect, like Seurat. But in honor of him, I made this sculpture, which I think speaks to that idea sort of chemistry and the spaces between colors, or proportions of colors. Back to the refracted light, another portrait that I made, or series of portraits. This was by projecting the light through this fairly crude template, came up with this image, which is the silhouette of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, a German polymath from the 18th, 19th, early 19th century, who the reason I was interested in him, he did a number of things, but he wrote a book on the theory of colors, and called The Theory of Colors. And part of his what he was up to was defining the psychological effects of colors. He was really the first one to make associations with colors into sort of the human psychology. So, red maybe being associated with anger, or cool colors being calming or something. This was another version of that same portrait. So I made this panel of mirrors, and they were individually adjustable, and they had a floating frame, which was covered, the back of which was covered with this collected cardboard and plastic trash. And from a certain angle, from a very specific angle, it would recreate this this silhouette portrait of Goethe. Some of the things that he was really interested in was also the sense of impermanence or transience. Big theme in all the work he did. He was really an early scientist, but artist, and a great example of where those two things overlap to some degree. Something I'm interested in, sort of displaying through the work, or investigating through the work. This work was more of a self-portrait. One of the first things I did when I got to grad school was I took this really cheap, thin plywood, and cut it out and covered my entire studio floor with it, and painted it white. So over the course of my first semester there, it collected all the spills and sort of shoe scuffs, and anything that happened in that space was etched into or recorded into that white surface. And then at the end of the semester, I took it into this gallery space. Along with that, throughout the semester, I've been collecting my clear plastic, all this clear plastic that I was building up, but also finding, going into the recycling bins around school. So this white floor got put on top of this clear plastic. You'll see there's a blown and mirrored glass orb that's hung from the ceiling. That's part of my contribution to the space as well. And then this line was jigsawed out of the floor, and this line was blown up MapQuest map. I remember MapQuest. I took a trip from Philadelphia to Seattle, and so I took that route, and I drew it into the floor with a jigsaw. So this piece was really about these layers of mapping my own experience, my own sort of existence, the studio floor, the collection of this plastic, this long road trip that was resource heavy, obviously, and burning a lot of fossil fuels. And there's some special title to this piece. It's not that important, but the map was actually drawn backwards so that it was experience. So this is like really what is a map of the United States. only really correctly viewed through this mirrored orb that's hanging from the ceiling. Kind of difficult to photograph. So Michael Joseph Owens, a character, a inventor, entrepreneur, a figure that some of you hopefully maybe are aware of. Somebody that I also felt the need to sort of create a series of sculptures enacted sort of as a portrait. So Michael Owens, despite never graduating from high school, certainly not going to college, having no formal training in mechanical engineering or mathematics or anything else, he was trained as a glass blower. He started as a mold boy and worked his way up through the factory glass system. And he wanted to eradicate child labor. And so by sheer force of will and sort of his own autodidactic abilities, he developed and marketed the automated glass blowing machine. This is a kind of a middle example of that. But I saw in this story a parallel with someone in my own family. On the right, this is my grandfather, who, like Owens, never got a high school diploma, but ended up, because he had these sort of natural engineering skills, he ended up working for General Motors, and throughout his life and career started a couple companies, even on his own. But he had a few patents for automated welding machines, and that helped make the production line for all sorts of, for auto parts, I think, manufacturing more efficient. So looking at this parallel between those two characters, I kind of was thinking about my own choice in life to become a glass blower, and how that's a pretty absurd choice when, 100 years ago, we figured out how to do this more efficiently and by machine, and there's no need for us to sort of make these objects. So I kind of doubled down on that absurdity by trying to replicate what Michael Owens' project, what his machine was doing, which was blowing glass bottles for containing, all sorts of things, medicines, liquor, perishable goods, and this idea of futilely competing with the automated processes. So making these, I just started making all these bottles, and these bottles became receptacles for collections, like the colored plastic. Just looking in the environment, finding things, bottles became a perfect way to display those things, to collect those things, display those things. This one seemingly relevant now, the rubber gloves, plaster. If I had a bucket of plaster that was about to set, you just grab a bottle and pour it in. The interesting thing about this, I thought, was that these also took on this sort of color idea, this tonal shift, more natural in a sense, less graphic and highly saturated than the colored plastic. But this was one of the ways that project got displayed. This was also part of my graduate thesis show. There's this high window. Actually, this is in line, a different space, but in line with that same window that I put the prism in initially to refract the colored light. So this is actually just right next door in the building, Tyler, which is kind of interesting. So this was, in a way, my portrait to Michael Owens and my grandfather, and maybe an intersectional portrait. Those things considering. Another thing that happened during that exhibition was I had this portfolio in this way of thinking about the process being the thing I was looking at, as opposed to maybe the object, was trying to bring the experience of something that's separated from us, that we feel sort of that's kind of been that has some layer of mediation, in this case like the internet. So I made this portfolio of Wikipedia articles, of again sort of a portraiture project of just historical figures that I was looking at, doing research into, Wikipedia being the obvious sort of immediate place to go to, but then thinking about materializing it by printing it being this even alchemical process that the artist undertakes to materialize something that otherwise wouldn't be. So it's even like a snapshot in time of because these things are transient, these things change. And I'm just throwing in here a couple more portraits. I was doing, really just doing a large array of portraits in all different ways. In this case, using a scanner bed, black silicone, and kind of like whatever you would call that process. Yeah, and this was I found this plastic that when you crumpled it, it would kind of unfurl itself in this very slow and methodical manner. And I thought, maybe I would try to capture portraits and, sort of materializing and dematerializing. In this case, I layered Karl Marx and Sarah Palin for some reason. This was 2010, so Palin was relevant for some reason. I think it'd be maybe somebody else now. Okay. So manufactured objects, another, I think, thematic umbrella that I tried to carve off here. So bolts, bottles, plastic stuff. This is actually a very early sculpture while I was an undergrad, pretty recent in learning to blow glass. That journey of trying to make the goblet, and in this case, often your first goblet is somehow glued together. In this case, I welded these bolts together and made this thing. So, and this is, I think all of these things are highly influenced by art history, looking at surrealist objects, these kind of assemblages, things that look back, or from my own perspective at least, are thinking more about the process that is undertaken than the finished object, although these are pretty slick finished objects. But this was really about an investigation and what I could possibly do. I mean, it may be similar to those drawings and like a real high attention to detail, trying to make something representational, trying to do something just right, putting my need for control into, a made object as opposed to, maybe other areas of my life. So I think about it a little bit. But this was, I think, a big part of my glass education was figuring out how to make these things. And these are, in some version of cast, cold worked and hot worked glass, and a lot of kind of mostly cold working and some glue in there too, right? Playing around with slumping things, trying to set up a pretty substantial challenge and meet it. These are functional to a sense, like that nut turns onto the bolt. The bolts were really developed, the first ones were developed to make this object, which was part of my undergraduate thesis show, anyway, a combination of sheet metal steel and these glass nuts and bolts. And this is maybe a bit of a counterpoint, but that was a whole lot of work happening to make something that maybe was more about trying to, again, complete a challenge or make something that's substantial, feels spectacular. This, I think, was an important turn into a little something that's slightly more humble, or recognizing that I didn't have to make it all. In this case, this is just a fountain beer bottle, but still this my own process, my own craft desires being overlaying this sense of preciousness, even though I'm removing material from this object and destroying its function, really with careful attention, making it more precious through the process. So detail of that object. So it's just a diamond drill bit and time and patience. Oh, and I'll return to that idea that this was a significant project for me. This happened entirely in my house, in my apartment. I had a tub of water and a Dremel with a flex shaft. And so thinking about making work at home, especially in these times, these were the kind of things, even glass processes, that I figured out ways to bring home and kind of do in the spare moments around eating and watching TV. This one, a liquor bottle that the holes were drilled out, and then I filled it with silicone, sealed my mouth on the top of that bottle, and blew really hard, and got this weird thing. I called this Exhale. Another object from around that same time, where playing with the optics of glass and water, these special properties that only glass has, but also wanting to, this plastic fork covered in, I think those were the tin foil that goes around those chocolates that you sometimes get at Christmas time. This sort of artifice of value, part of my idea around that object. This is a fun project I've done a number of times. Maybe if I get to come back, maybe we could try this. It takes about 6 or 7 people and 2 glory holes and garage and pickup kilns and all sorts of stuff. It's kind of like a slab building process, a little bit of combining Venetian technique and just sheer will to cobble together sheet glass sections. This is, in this case, security glass. But anyway, nice shiny object for you. So this project was, I had this opportunity to work at the University of Sunderland for a time, and I had a glass shop. I didn't have assistants that I would have had to pay for assistants. I had a friend come by for a couple days, but I can mostly make these glass bottles by myself, having made them for years and years and years. Again, my prompt to myself is to compete with the automated glass blowing machine and try to make these things as well as possible. So I was making these glass bottles, and they had a water jet cutting operation there. So I decided to try to, I thought I might be interested to investigate what it'd be like to make this handmade object that's trying to reference a machine-made object with a machine in some sort of way, and complicate it a little bit. So first thing I had to do was get an accurate silhouette of the bottle. So I actually stitched together, these are a series of photographs at different angles to eliminate the perspective that happens when you photograph from any place. So that's why the lines and the X's are for. And then with the help of the faculty there at Sunderland, this is Jeff Sarmiento helping me with the 3D printing, the 3D modeling, which I'm not that, I'm not really trained in at all, but he was able to take that silhouette through the pictures and make, this 3D model of this bottle. And then using a program that might still be around, maybe it's changed, it's called 123D Make. Pretty rapidly, efficiently, you can take that model and then turn it into a waffle, which was how the 3D, the water jet cutting process was being used mostly in the studio. A lot of people were making these waffled objects. So it could you could then slap a sheet of float glass up on the water jet cutter, and within minutes you had this form that could be assembled. And but then again, thinking about my own sort of desire to insert a bit of an absurd subversion of that process. I made my own sheet glass, so blowing some cylinders, and then this process of opening up the cylinders by heating them up in a kiln, cutting them open on the one end and cutting them along the side. Traditional way of making sheet glass. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with, and something I do quite a bit these days. But so I made this material, and the thing about this material is it's an uneven thickness. So what this required of the process was then laying out these patterns of the waffled bottle onto the sheet glass ahead of time. Those little marcations around the outside are measured thicknesses of the sheet glass. So then I would have to estimate how we would need to adjust the model digitally for those gaps, so that it would actually fit together. So, really, again, this is kind of like a Fluxus project, and it's less about the object and more about like looking at the process and considering the process. Having to go into this relatively efficient process of 3D computer-aided design, and meticulously adjusting the program so that this thing would actually work. This is the material that came out of the sheet glass post water jet cut. I edited out the video of the water jet cutting because it's kind of loud, and I think we all know what that looks like anymore. But what's kind of fun for me is, even with all that work, it still required really hours of hand cold working to get these things to fit together, and then they were glued together. And so this was the resulting object, and you can see also I kind of lined up those templates so that it would be thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top, which those crafty glass blower people amongst us know that's our big goal when we try to blow a glass object. So trying to reflect that as well. This is how that project looked all together, sort of that initial source bottle, the float glass bottle, and then the sheet glass in that process. Okay, so this was actually a very pivotal and important project as well. Again, kind of looking at both like these really complicated projects and processes, and then going back to like stupid simplicity, making this over the course of maybe like a day or two in my own space at home. This collection of lighters, and collecting all these colored objects. Obviously I had a whole 1 gallon freezer bag full of lighters at this point, and found these 9 lighters that worked really well together. And then made this really simple glass case for them, thinking about glass as a vehicle for observation, as something that you kind of like is not the thing you're looking at, but the thing you're looking through. And that, that has led to really the rest of these objects I think I'm going to show for a minute here. This far more updated and sort of slick version of that. This kind of color wheel that was designed, developed, and made during a residency I had at STARworks in North Carolina. This big factory space. So they had this box of glass. So taking these windows and an idea of documenting in a window, I guess. But these individual spaces containing the plastic. I had an opportunity to work with the staff at the Museum of American Glass for an exhibition at WheatonArts in Millville, New Jersey, and uh, I was invited to be part of this show. The part of the museum that I had was these these window spaces in this room, and so I wanted to work with their collection, and they mostly have these examples of American press glass. Really, it's it's the Museum of American Glass, so early American glass, a lot of press glass, and went through their storerooms and then sorted, organized, and made this display in one of their windows. One of the other windows became an opportunity to put on display the bottle collection in another iteration. There's some other collections kind of interspersed in this window. One window was filled with blown glass, colored sheet glass that I've been making both as cylinders and then as the finished sheet glass, some of the process remnants. And then there were 4 windows, and then the 4th window was really designed to show and highlight these objects, which were these carefully encased individual plastic and rubber, in one case, objects. In this case, below them, a collection of sort of categorized broken glass from the cullet bins at Wheaton, my own process remnants, and then above them were collections of plastic objects in different categories. And then they sort of, blended together in the middle into this combination of the glass encasements of the plastic objects. But these were, this was sort of have a direct connection back to that case of lighters. And really, this was, I had an experience when I was in an undergrad where I was given an assignment in, no prerequisite glass class, what was called cold glass at OSU, to build a box around an object. And at the time, I did a hammer. I don't have a great photograph of it, but I remember that project a lot, and it was a great example of where like an art school prompt was like, something you could just like take and go with for the rest of your life, and that may be what I do. But this for me was a kind of an epiphany to just take these objects I've been collecting anyway and build these very special enclosures for them. And this is what I've been up to sort of since, probably for about 3 or 4 years now, in addition to other things. But this is a process. I can do the glass cutting at home. I use silicone glue to do the glue seams. It's a little messy, but I'm strategic about how the glue goes in there so I can carve away and clean it up on the outside. And thinking back to that idea, perception is, taking these objects that would otherwise be sort of neglected or discarded by this careful attention to the way they're displayed, organized, trying to change, subvert, highlight, sort of the formal quality certainly, but maybe also something beyond that. In this case, in most of what you saw before was float glass, standard single strength float glass. In this case, this is actually clear blown glass, which I'm starting to do too. Make my own clear cylinders in the hot shop and slump them open and use that glass for this process. This was a collaboration with Sarah Vaughn, who I thought, we kind of were looking at what each other were doing. She was carving with two-toning lighters. Also this absurd gesture to a irrelevant object to make it seem more special or something. So we thought we'd tried collaboration together. This was a pretty good example. Okay, last category of sorts, the fourth dimension. So fourth dimension being time. And in this category, I'd also include interactive work. And this is an early example, but I'm still developing projects like this, where these sculptures do have a timeline, even though they're not maybe kinetic, or this isn't a video, this is a sculpture that people actually interacted with. But there's this timeline where you kind of experience this thing with a relative sense of confusion, not quite sure what's going on. In this case, you enter the room and there's this pile of glass, and it just kind of looks like, oh, that's contemporary art, pile of trash. But then as you move through the space, you know, if willing, you can kind of end up in a spot where you put your face up to this thing, and then it makes sense visually, and you know, the climax of the moment, and then your perceptions hopefully shift as you kind of unpack or you know, reevaluate what it is you're experiencing. So a really early example of that, probably the most literal and formal in a sense, but I'm going to skip through that. Here, this is sort of the back half, or an additional, like maybe cousin project to the bottles that were up on the shelf. I also developed this contraption, which was a way to view what had been collected in those bottles, this material that had been collecting over time. I took photographs of all the bottles. The photographs were printed and they were installed on the outer edge of this white disc. The central large mirrored bottle, right under that, tethered to it, was this cart. On the cart there was a video camera running closed circuit to a television, and then as you push the cart around the disc, it would create this animation. I have to start this one. Yeah. It would create this animation of the reflection of the photograph bottles. I was thinking about, you know, this idea of like separation, mediation, displacing our experience from the actual material, the actual process. Again, a little bit of a reference to the automated glass blowing machine, but also this is based on this contraption called a zoopraxioscope, which was developed by Edward Muybridge, which is a pre-cinematic device, a way to create fairly crude animations by spinning a disc and having that break your vision, and that in some ways magically resolves something that looks like it's moving. Edward Muybridge being involved in this series of photographs that were initiated by Leland Stanford, who is a railroad magnate, future or previous governor of California, I believe. But he took on this challenge to try to prove or disprove the fact that when a horse was galloping or trotting, I'm not quite sure, my horse terminology is poor, but that there was some suspicion that their hooves might leave the ground or might not. In paintings up to that point, you'd never seen a painting of a horse with all its hooves off the ground at the same time. It was so fast. So this kind of photography that Edward Muybridge helped develop, helped reveal that to everybody. The interesting thing for me about this history was it was Antoine Jules Marais who actually first proposed that idea. he was a French physiologist, and Muybridge being a this photographer, innovative photographer, again helped figure it out. Muybridge took that moment. He was an entrepreneur, certainly too, and even though it wasn't really his project, he took that moment and ran with it and became the pre-cinematic photographer. But really, that sort of the idea belongs to Murray in some ways. The thing that is interesting is Muybridge and Murray were born the same year and died on the same day in 1904, which I think is a nice little anecdote. But Murray also developed, influenced by Muybridge. I know this is really confusing. Look back at the recording to try to get the real history, or do your own research. But Murray created his own set of what he called chronophotographs to document animal locomotion. In this case, he was trying to, again, prove or disprove these ideas about how animals worked. When you drop a cat, or a cat falls out of a tree or off a roof, how it always lands on its feet, that old wives' tale we're all familiar with. Anyway, long story, even longer. We get to this animation I found on the internet, which was, which I thought reminded me of the Muybridge moment, Sally Gardner, the horse that they recorded trotting or galloping. And I took it on myself to also associate that with this myth of Sisyphus, the from Greek mythology, who was punished for his deceitfulness and forced to carry a boulder up the mountainside only to see it tumble back again over and over again, alluding to this laborious futility. So I wanted to develop a project to sort of reflect, triangulate these things that I was thinking about, and this was my design, and this is the project, which I called Sisyphus. And this is essentially a zoetrope, which is similar to that pre-cinematic device that Muybridge developed. He was also making these kind of devices during his heyday. In this case, I take this internet GIF that I found and replicate it through a stroboscopic zoetrope with blown glass. Okay. Back to the refracted light. Some part of my practice, I think a significant part, especially recently, has been actually participating in some collaborations. This is one that's I think is very fun. A graduate student at Tyler at the time, Pan, a friend of mine, saw this rainbow being sort of projected through the space and had this idea to have a dual party, a morning rainbow party and a late night karaoke rainbow party. So this was the morning party, and we put a disco ball in the light, and then at night we used a spotlight in the disco ball. And then I'm gonna go to this really quick. For this. So, and then Pan developed this karaoke song and video based on her experience. She was not a glass blower. Based on her experience learning a new language, both being from China and living in the United States, and learning the new language of glass blowing. All right, I'll stop there. You can go back. So that's had 10 views. It's called Ice Cold. You can go check that out your own time. All right, let me see if I can get back to this. All right, we're back. Okay, and then the other thing I'll talk about real briefly, I know we're getting towards the end of all of our attention, but FVO, which really started coming up with this name, Flock the Optic, was sort of quarantined for a bit of time on Pilchuck campus. I did the Emerging Artist in Residence in 2014. And these two artists were there as well. Liesl Schubel on the left, Abram Delorier. And I think this was actually a picture from the night that Flock the Optic formed, which was Halloween 2014. That's where the, those are wigs. But we were hanging out a lot. We were coming up with band names, and then something about this name Flock the Optic had some sort of resonance, and then it became a word game. This project really started as a word game, and so Flock the Optic became FVO, which then became all these other FVOs, and it really was just this sort of crude poetry and playfulness and fun, which isn't my default setting, but I think it is something that exists in our community as glass makers that we shouldn't be ashamed of, that making glass is fun, and the community and that aspect is really important. And that's something that we kind of really wanted to reflect in this project. For all of our existence, we've lived in different places. So a lot of our communications and planning and projects develop over this teleconferencing that we're doing right now. So another way in which I think my practice is suited for this time. But this was, we would play with optical phenomena. One of the things that was happening near Pilchuck at the time, use of, protective masks while in public. One of the things that was happening at Pilchuck during the time was there was the snow goose population was coming through the Skagit Valley. And Liesl's work has a lot to do with gravity and levity. And so she took, we kind of adopted this idea of the snow goose migration and that idea of the flock being similar to maybe even artists who travel the world or migrate and congregate at a certain place, Pilchuck maybe being that place, or a place like your studio there at SIU or where I'm at or have been. I think people can relate. But one of the things Liesl did was develop these paper snow goose puppets. And I helped develop a system to automate them. A lot of this, even the formalizing what we were doing was brought on by this Third Thursday performance series that Charlotte Potter started at the Chrysler Museum of Art Studio. Kayla was there. Kayla was part of this first performance. And so that was really, we sort of had this idea early on to propose something for that. And somehow it was accepted. And so we ended up doing this. This was January of 2016, our first performance being You've Got to Flap Up to Float Down. I remember this moment from, I think, the movie, what is that movie? Spinal Tap, where they request M&Ms be separated in their dressing room or something. So that was one of the things we made assistant here, Ali Feeney, do, was take a big bowl of M&Ms and refract them into the rainbow. At the end, we cleared the floor and lowered these paper puppets and invited everybody out on the floor to dance and activate the puppets. This project has had has materialized, manifested in a number of different places and ways. This was a collaboration with Tina Offiero. Tina had an opportunity to be part of this show in Seattle called 9 Evenings 2. And this was right around the 2016 election. And our paper birds were sort of combined with this patriotic imagery. These, again, were driven by a motorized system, and was all experienced through this kaleidoscopic viewing portal that would actually also project the viewer's image into that patriotic scene. We got invited into an exhibition at Wheaton. This was not an actual installation. This is a proposal, so this is digitally rendered. Whether those are poop stains or silhouettes of birds flying over, I'm not quite sure at this point. But this was one of the ideas, was to cover the whole roof of Wheaton with mirrored bird silhouettes. Really just ended up a good opportunity to climb up on the roof of Wheaton for a second. What we did end up doing, Hank Adams, who was there as the artistic director at the time, really wanted us to activate the campus. So one of the things we ended up doing was the team there, led by Skitch Mannion, made these very large blown glass eggs, and we built nests throughout the campus and had these gigantic glass eggs, different places. And then in this one building on the campus called the schoolhouse, an old schoolhouse, we did an installation of the paper birds that were then viewed through this little vestibule where you entered in a couple different ways, through a large water-filled bottle that magnified the space in this wall of kaleidoscope mirrors, and that's a view through the kaleidoscope. And then when you entered the space, motion activation sensor would start the motor, and these things would start to flap their wings. We returned last year. It feels a lot longer ago than that, but last year we returned to the Chrysler and did a performance that involved, it was a little less glass blowing involved, and it was much more of the sort of play acting of this scene where these snow geese, these three being the main characters, collected all these twigs and then built this nest for their eggs. And then there's this moment where the foxes come along and try to steal the eggs. And I don't know, it was a lot of fun. It was pretty surreal. These eggs being hot popped and revealing the mysterious insides of them at some point. It's a very collaborative project. In this case, this is Julia Robin and Julia Rogers, right? Rogers, who came up with this idea, who developed this plan to have this dry ice come out of the egg. So that's very cool. So a big part of the project is allowing others' ideas in and working with a lot of people. We did something at the Urban Glass Studios where we were part of the auction gala after party, and so the geeses ended up blowing a little bit of glass. And it's usually a pretty fun, if chaotic, adventure when FVO is involved. So if it ever happens again, if you get a chance, come hang out. And that is, I think, hopefully all I have to say about that. But I'm happy to, answer questions.